"I'll give you my plane if you translate this." Millionaire Richard Sterling laughed, pointing at the janitor. He had no idea he was making a bet with the wrong person. It was a rainy Friday in June when Margaret Maggie O'Sullivan arrived for her morning shift at Sterling International Holdings on prestigious Park Avenue in Manhattan. Richard was especially irritated because he'd lost a $50 million international contract due to translation problems. The 58-year-old Irish-American janitor was quietly pushing her cart down the marble hallway when Richard shouted from the boardroom, "Hey you, come here!" Richard Sterling was 48 years old and commanded an import-export empire spanning from New York to Los Angeles. His Armani suits cost more than 10 employees' annual salaries. To him, people like Maggie were just part of the infrastructure, useful but invisible. "Jennifer," he yelled at his secretary, "why can't these cleaning people stay in their place? I'm trying to solve a crisis here." Maggie stopped her cart and approached respectfully. "Sorry, Mr. Sterling, didn't mean to disturb you." Her green eyes sparkled with an intelligence that went completely unnoticed by the Harvard and Yale executives present. "Disturb," Richard laughed with the typical cruelty of Wall Street elite. "You can't even disturb anything. You're just a janitor." He turned to the 5 vice presidents gathered around the mahogany table. "Guys, look at this. I lost $50 million because no translator in New York City can decipher this ancient Arabic document, and I have a cleaning lady offering to help." Maggie glanced discreetly at the document on the table. It was a manuscript in classical Arabic, but she could see there were also passages in Persian and Ottoman Turkish. Her heart raced. She knew those languages like the back of her hand. "Mr. Sterling," she said politely, "may I take a look at the document?" The laughter that followed echoed throughout the entire floor. Richard slammed the table, tears of laughter streaming down his face. "Look at this! The janitor wants to take a look! What are you going to do, Maggie? Clean the words until they make sense." The executives laughed nervously. Maggie maintained her dignity intact, but her fists clenched imperceptibly. She had endured 5 years of silent humiliations at this company, but this moment was touching a very deep wound. "Maggie," Richard continued with venomous sarcasm, "you can barely write your own name properly. How are you going to translate a document that the best specialists in New York couldn't decipher?" He picked up the manuscript and waved it in front of her. "This thing is worth $50 million. It's about rare Middle Eastern antiquities." Maggie took a deep breath. "Sir, if you'd allow me, I could try." "Try?" Richard exploded in even louder laughter. "A janitor is going to try to translate ancient Arabic? What's next? You gonna teach me how to fly my private jet too?" That's when Richard had the idea that would change his life forever. His eyes gleamed with cruel malice as he looked at his $200,000 Rolex. "You know what, Maggie? I'm going to make a bet with you." Maggie looked at him cautiously. "What kind of bet, sir?" Richard stood up theatrically, walking to the window that showed the helipad where his private Gulfstream G650 was parked. "See that jet over there? Worth $15 million. I'll give it to you entirely if you can translate this document." The silence in the boardroom was total. The executives looked at each other shocked. Jennifer, the secretary, covered her mouth with her hands. Maggie looked through the window at the gleaming aircraft and then at the document on the table. "Are you sure about this bet, sir?" she asked calmly. "Absolutely sure," Richard shouted, euphoric with his own brilliance. "Because I know you can't do it. It's impossible. A 58-year-old janitor who barely finished high school is going to translate a manuscript that left PhDs in Oriental languages perplexed." He turned to the executives like a circus ringmaster. "Guys, you're witnesses. If Maggie here can translate this document and explain what it means, I'll give her my jet. But when she fails miserably, I want everyone to see that I was right about knowing everyone's place in this company." Maggie looked at the document again. It was a purchase and sale contract for antiquities between an Ottoman merchant and a Persian collector from the 16th century. She could read every word, every nuance, every legal implication. But there was something more, a hidden clause that could solve the company's problem much more profitably than Richard imagined. "Mr. Sterling," she said with a firm voice, "I accept your bet, but I want everyone here to be witnesses. When I translate this document and explain its complete meaning, you're going to give me the keys to that jet." Richard laughed until he turned red. "Ha, of course I will, because it's impossible. Jennifer, call everyone from the floor to see this. I want everyone to watch the janitor make a fool of herself." Maggie placed her hands on the document with the reverence of someone handling a treasure. She had waited 35 years for a moment like this. A moment to show who she really was beneath the janitor's uniform. Within minutes, the boardroom was packed. Richard had summoned all the employees from the floor to watch the show. Directors, managers, secretaries, interns, all crowded curiously to see what was happening. "Folks," Richard announced like a master of ceremonies, "you're about to witness something historic today. Our dear Maggie here thinks she can translate an ancient Arabic document that left New York's best specialists baffled." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Some employees seemed uncomfortable with the situation, but others laughed openly. Maggie remained dignified, but her eyes began to shine with a determination few noticed. "Richard," intervened Dr. Henry Thompson, the legal director, "are you sure about this bet? 15 million is a lot of money." "Henry, relax." Richard patted his colleague's shoulder. "It's money I'll never lose. Look at her." He pointed at Maggie as if she were an object on display, a middle-aged janitor who probably never even seen a book properly in her life. Maggie took a deep breath. For 5 years, she had endured comments like that in silence. Comments about her education, her social class, her stupidity. But today would be different. "Mr. Sterling," she said calmly, "before I begin, may I ask what exactly were the difficulties that other translators encountered?" Richard guffawed. "Want hints now, Maggie? How cute. All right, I'll tell you." He picked up a folder with technical opinions. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, PhD in Oriental Languages from Columbia, said the document is extremely complex, with archaic dialects and obscure historical references. Professor Ahmad Hassan from NYU said it requires specialized knowledge in classical Arabic, medieval Persian, and Ottoman Turkish. Maggie nodded understandingly. "I see. And what exactly did they manage to translate?" "Practically nothing," Richard laughed with malice. "The most they could do was identify that it's some kind of ancient commercial contract. But the details, the clauses, the real meaning, nothing." "Interesting," Maggie murmured, examining the document more closely. She could see that the specialists had failed because they were trying to translate word by word without understanding the historical and cultural context of the period. "Dr. Wilson," Richard addressed the import director, "tell Maggie what the importance of this document is for our company." Dr. Wilson cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, Maggie, this document supposedly proves the authenticity of a collection of antiquities we want to purchase. Without the complete translation, we can't verify the provenance of the pieces, and this prevents us from closing a $50 million deal." Maggie nodded, absorbing the information. "And if the translation shows that the antiquities are fake or stolen," Richard laughed even louder. "Look at this! The janitor is worrying about legal details now. Maggie, you don't even know what provenance means." "Actually," Maggie replied calmly, Provenance refers to the origin and ownership history of an object, especially important in art and antiquities to verify authenticity and legality. A momentary silence fell. Some employees looked at each other, surprised by Maggie's articulate response. But Richard quickly regained control. Very well, he applauded sarcastically. You memorized the definition somewhere. That doesn't change the fact that you can't read a single line of this document. Maggie smiled for the first time. Mr. Sterling, would you like me to start the translation now, or do you prefer to continue underestimating me for a few more minutes? The question caught Richard by surprise. There was something in Maggie's tone, a quiet confidence he hadn't noticed before. But he quickly disguised his discomfort with more aggression. Underestimate me? Maggie, it's not underestimating when it's fact. You're a janitor. I'm a businessman graduated from Wharton with an MBA from Harvard. Understand business, you understand cleaning. Everyone in their place. Maggie picked up the document carefully, like someone handling something precious. You're right about one thing, Mr. Sterling. Everyone has their place. And sometimes we discover that a person's place isn't where society put them. Richard frowned. There was something in the way Maggie spoke that bothered him. She was too articulate, too confident for a simple janitor. But he pushed away the feeling with more. Bravado. Enough with the cheap philosophy, he shouted. Either you translate this document now or admit you're bluffing and go back to your cleaning cart. Maggie looked around the room, seeing the dozens of expectant faces. Some curious, others mocking, a few seeming to root for her. She thought about the 5 years of silent humiliations, the cruel jokes, the derogatory comments she had swallowed quietly. All right, Mr. Sterling, she said, placing the document on the table and adjusting her simple glasses. Let's begin. Maggie began examining the document with an attention that surprised everyone. She wasn't just looking, she was studying systematically, her eyes moving with the precise pattern of someone who knew exactly what to look for. Interesting, she murmured, pointing to a specific section. This seal here indicates that the document was authenticated by the Merchants' Council of Istanbul in 1547. Richard stopped laughing. How do you know that? Maggie smiled slightly. The Ottoman symbol is quite distinctive. See here, she delicately traced the characters with her finger. This specific mark was only used in official documents during the period of Suleiman the Magnificent. A murmur passed through the crowd. Dr. Wilson approached to get a better look. Maggie, how do you know Ottoman history? Well, Doctor, Maggie replied modestly, you learn a few things throughout life. Richard was starting to get nervous, but he disguised it with more aggression. Stop stalling, Maggie. Anyone can make up these stories about symbols. Translate the actual text. Maggie nodded patiently. Of course, Mr. Sterling, but first I need to explain something important about this document. She pointed to different sections of the text. It's not just Arabic. There are passages in classical Persian, Ottoman Turkish, and even some words in ancient Armenian. Armenian? Dr. Henry approached, clearly intrigued. How do you recognize ancient Armenian? Oh, it's a fascinating language, Maggie explained naturally, very different from modern Armenian. See here, she pointed to a specific line. This word, Vartabed, means doctor of theology, indicating that part of the document was written or authenticated by Armenian ecclesiastical authorities. The silence in the room was becoming palpable. Richard felt a growing chill in his stomach. Maggie, how the hell do you know all this? Maggie looked at him with an indecipherable expression. Do you want me to continue with the translation, or would you prefer to keep asking questions? Just continue! Richard shouted, but his voice came out higher than intended. Maggie returned her attention to the document. Very well. The first section says, In the name of the Most High, the Merciful and Compassionate, this contract is established between Mahmud ibn Abdullah al-Tujjar, antiquities merchant of Istanbul, and Mirza Hossein Safavi, collector of the court of Shah Tahmasp, in the year 955 of the Hijra. Dr. Wilson was speechless. That corresponds exactly to what the specialists managed to decipher from the introduction, but it took them 3 weeks to reach that translation. Oh, yes, Maggie agreed casually. It's because they were probably trying to translate word by word without considering the commercial conventions of the era. But let's continue. Richard was sweating cold now. Wait, how did you translate that so fast? Maggie looked at him with almost maternal patience. Mr. Sterling, do you want me to explain my translation methodology, or do you want to know the content of the document that can solve the company's problem? The content! Richard shouted desperately. Perfect, Maggie smiled. Then let's get to the interesting part. The document lists a collection of 47 pieces: Sumerian statuettes, Byzantine manuscripts, Persian jewelry, Seljuk ceramics. She paused and looked directly at Richard. The same collection the company is trying to purchase. Dr. Wilson almost dropped the papers he was holding. How do you know about our negotiation? That's confidential. Maggie laughed softly. Doctor, I've been cleaning this office for 5 years. Do you think I'm deaf as well as stupid? The observation cut through the air like a blade. Several employees lowered their eyes, embarrassed. Richard was turning red with anger and nervousness. But here's the crucial point, Maggie continued, pointing to a specific section of the document. This clause here establishes that the collection can only be sold with the presence and approval of 3 sacred witnesses: the Imam of the Fatih Mosque, the Patriarch of the Armenian Church of Kumkapu, and the Chief Rabbi of Balat. Dr. Henry frowned. What does this mean in practice? Maggie smiled with a wisdom that completely contrasted with her janitor position. It means that any sale of this collection without this specific approval is legally null according to Ottoman laws of the time. And since the original document was never officially revoked, the pieces are still technically under legal protection, Dr. Wilson completed, clearly shocked. Exactly, Maggie confirmed, which means that the current seller has no legal right to sell them. Any buyer would technically be receiving stolen goods. Richard was pale as a ghost. You're saying that the $50 million deal is illegal? Not illegal, Maggie corrected patiently. Invalid. There's an important legal difference. The pieces would have to be returned without compensation if someone contested based on this document. Dr. Henry was clearly agitated. Richard, if this is true, we could lose $50 million and still face international lawsuits. But how does a janitor know all this? Richard exploded, completely losing his composure. Maggie looked at him with a calm that was almost supernatural. Mr. Sterling, this is just the beginning of the translation. Do you want me to continue, or would you prefer to cancel our bet because you're getting nervous? The challenge hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Richard looked around the room, seeing the shocked expressions of his employees, and realized he was in a situation he might not be able to get out of unscathed. Richard tried to regain control of the situation, but his confidence was clearly shaken. Listen here, Maggie. Even if you manage to translate that part, which I still find suspicious, that doesn't mean you'll be able to translate the entire document. Do you want to cancel the bet? Maggie asked serenely. No, Richard shouted, more to himself than to her. I won't cancel anything. Continue with this charade until you fail miserably. Dr. Wilson approached Richard and whispered, Richard, maybe we should reconsider. Shut up, Wilson, Richard bellowed, making the director recoil. You're all being fooled by a pathetic performance. She must have memorized this information somewhere. Maggie smiled patiently. "If you believe I memorized it, I can answer specific questions about any part of the document." "Great!" Richard grabbed the manuscript and pointed to a random section in the middle of the page. "Translate this part here, without time to think." Maggie looked at where he was pointing and immediately responded, "And it was agreed that the pieces of Syrian origin, specifically the 3 bronze horses of Aleppo and the 2 silver cups of Damascus, shall carry the special seal of Governor Ahmad Pasha, as guarantee that they were not looted during the siege of 1540. Dr. Henry was speechless. "Richard, she translated it on the spot, without hesitation." "It's coincidence!" Richard shouted desperately. "She must have seen this document before. Someone showed it to her." Maggie laughed softly. "Mr. Sterling, this document arrived yesterday morning by diplomatic pouch. I was cleaning your office when you opened it for the first time. You yourself said it was the first time you'd seen this manuscript." Jennifer, the secretary, agreed timidly. "It's true, Mr. Richard. The document came yesterday directly from the Turkish embassy. Nobody had access before." Richard was cornered and knew it. He tried one last, desperate card. "Even so, even if you can read some words, that doesn't mean you understand the real meaning. Translation isn't just reading words." "You're right," Maggie agreed. "Translation is interpreting context, culture, and implications. For example, when the document mentions the Sultan's tax is paid, that doesn't just mean that taxes were settled." "What does it mean then, smartass?" Richard asked with sarcasm. Maggie explained patiently. "In the Ottoman context, that phrase indicates that the pieces were officially registered in the imperial inventory. This means they have a specific cataloging number in the Topkapi Palace archive." Dr. Wilson was impressed. "And this is important because it means we can verify the authenticity of each piece by consulting Ottoman historical archives," Maggie explained. "But it also means that some pieces may still be considered Turkish historical patrimony, complicating importation." Richard was sweating profusely now. How do you know about historical patrimony laws?" Maggie looked at him with an indescribable expression. "You learn many things in life, Mr. Sterling." Dr. Henry tried to intervene diplomatically. "Maggie, we don't want to be indiscreet, but your demonstration of knowledge is impressive. Where exactly did you learn all this?" Maggie hesitated for a moment. "Dr. Henry, is this relevant to the document translation?" "Well, not directly, but then I suggest we continue," Maggie interrupted politely. "There are still very important parts to translate." Richard was desperate now. He grabbed his phone and dialed frantically. "Dr. Rodriguez, Richard Sterling here. I need you to come to my office now." "Yes, about the Arabic document. No, I haven't solved it yet. Just come." He hung up and looked defiantly at Maggie. "I called Dr. Michael Rodriguez, PhD in Oriental Languages from Colombia. Let's see if your translations match the analysis of a real specialist." Maggie nodded calmly. "Excellent idea. A second opinion will be useful." Maggie's unshakable confidence was making Richard increasingly nervous. He began pacing in circles like a caged animal. "Maggie," Dr. Wilson asked hesitantly, "are you sure you can continue translating while we wait for the specialist?" Maggie smiled. "Of course. Actually, there's a section here that you'll find particularly interesting." She pointed to the end of the document. "It's about a right of recovery clause that could completely change the company's situation." "Right of recovery?" Richard asked involuntarily. Maggie looked at him with an expression that mixed patience with something he couldn't identify. "Something that could transform this 50 million problem into a 200 million opportunity, Mr. Sterling." The silence in the room was absolute. Everyone present realized they were witnessing something extraordinary, but nobody yet knew just how extraordinary it would be. Richard was visibly nervous, waiting for Dr. Rodriguez's arrival, but he couldn't show weakness in front of his employees. He decided to double down on the bet in a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "You know what, Maggie?" he said with a forced smile. "Since you're acting so smart, I'm going to make our little bet more interesting." Maggie looked at him with curiosity. "How so, sir?" Richard pointed through the window to where his Lamborghini Huracan was parked next to the jet. "See that car over there? Lamborghini Huracan, 630 horsepower, imported directly from Italy, cost me $350,000. It's a beautiful car," Maggie agreed simply. "I'll give you my plane if you translate this," Richard suddenly shouted, repeating the phrase that would title the video, "and I'll throw in the Lamborghini as a bonus." The silence in the room was sepulchral. Dr. Henry tried to intervene. "Richard, you're talking about almost $20 million. "I know how much I'm betting," Richard bellowed, completely beside himself. "Because I know she can't do it. It's impossible. A semi-literate janitor is going to teach me about Oriental languages." Maggie remained calm, but her eyes gleamed with an icy satisfaction. "Mr. Sterling, are you absolutely certain about this bet? Because I accept." "Of course I'm certain," Richard laughed hysterically. "Look at all of you, a 58-year-old woman who makes $2,400 a month cleaning bathrooms. Do you really think she knows more than doctors in linguistics?" That's when Dr. Michael Rodriguez arrived, an elegant man of about 60 years old, carrying a leather briefcase. "Richard, what's happening here?" Richard ran to him like a castaway grabbing a life preserver. "Dr. Rodriguez, thank God you're here. This person here is claiming she can translate the Arabic document." Dr. Rodriguez looked at Maggie with curiosity. "Interesting. And has she demonstrated any specific knowledge?" "She memorized some phrases," Richard said desperately. "But I want you to expose this farce." Dr. Rodriguez approached Maggie politely. "Ma'am, could you show me what you've managed to translate?" Maggie smiled respectfully. "With pleasure, Doctor. I'll begin with the document identification. It's a commercial contract established in 955 of the Hijra between Mahmud ibn Abdullah al-Tujjar and Mirza Hossein Safavi, authenticated by the Merchants' Council of Istanbul." Dr. Rodriguez frowned. That's correct. Continue." Maggie proceeded fluently. "The document lists 47 antiquities, including 3 bronze horses of Aleppo, 2 silver cups of Damascus, manuscripts from the Abbasid period." She continued listing the pieces with perfect precision. Dr. Rodriguez was visibly impressed. "Ma'am, your translation is impeccable, but let me test something more complex." He pointed to a section that had left the best translators perplexed. "This passage here, with references to Bait al-Hikmah and Khizanat al-Kutub. Can you explain the meaning?" Maggie looked at where he was pointing and responded immediately. "Oh yes, Bait al-Hikmah refers to the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, and Khizanat al-Kutub means library or book repository. The text indicates that some of the listed pieces originally came from Harun al-Rashid's library, which significantly increases their historical value." Dr. Rodriguez went pale. "My God, it took me 3 weeks trying to decipher that passage. How did you—" Richard interrupted, desperately. "Dr. Rodriguez, don't be fooled. She must have consulted your previous studies." "Impossible." Dr. Rodriguez shook his head. "This interpretation about Harun al-Rashid's library, I never reached this conclusion. Actually, it's brilliant." Maggie smiled modestly. "Doctor, there's still a more interesting part, the final clause of the document." She pointed to the last section, written in more elaborate calligraphy. "Here it says, 'And it is established that if any Descendant of the original seller questions, this sale within 500 lunar years, presenting the family seal and 3 reliable witnesses, the transaction shall be considered null, and the pieces must return to the family without compensation. Dr. Wilson almost dropped his papers. 500 lunar years. That would be approximately 485 solar years, Maggie completed. The document was signed in 1547. We're in 2024. The clause is still technically valid for 8 more years. Dr. Rodriguez was in shock. Ma'am, this clause, I couldn't translate it. The calligraphy is extremely complex, with abbreviations in archaic Ottoman dialect. It's understandable, Maggie said gently. This type of Ottoman legal writing requires knowledge not only of the language, but also of the legal codes of the era and specific notarial conventions. How does a janitor know this? Richard exploded, completely losing his composure. Maggie looked at him with an indecipherable expression. Mr. Sterling, do you want me to finish the translation, or would you prefer to continue shouting? Finish this charade now, Richard bellowed, but his voice came out trembling. Maggie returned her attention to the document. There's still a very important discovery. This section here, she pointed to a margin of the document, contains later annotations in Persian dated 1592. They're notes from a merchant named Mirza Reza, who tracked the fate of each piece in the collection. Dr. Rodriguez approached to examine. Incredible. These annotations are almost invisible. How did you notice them? Experience, Maggie replied simply. The annotations reveal that 23 of the 47 pieces were subsequently donated to 3 specific mosques in Istanbul. According to Islamic law, this would make them waqf, inalienable religious patrimony. What does this mean? Dr. Henry asked. Maggie explained patiently. It means these 23 pieces cannot be sold for any price. They are perpetual religious patrimony. Any attempt to commercialize them would be considered sacrilege. Richard was trembling now. You're saying that half the collection can't be purchased? Worse than that, Maggie continued implacably. The annotations indicate that the other 24 pieces were divided between 2 families, the Al-Dimashqi and the Safavid. And here's the interesting part. She smiled with a satisfaction that made everyone in the room feel a chill. According to these annotations, the Al-Dimashqi family never officially sold their pieces. They were loaned to a merchant in 1923, but the loan contract specified they should return after 100 years. Dr. Wilson calculated quickly. 2023. The deadline expired last year. Exactly, Maggie confirmed, which means the Al-Dimashqi pieces have been in illegal possession for a year, and the Safavid pieces... She paused dramatically. Well, there's an even bigger surprise about those. Richard was white as paper. What surprise? Maggie looked directly into his eyes. According to the annotations, 3 of the Safavid pieces were illegally smuggled to America in 1979 to a dealer who resold them to private collectors in New York. The silence in the room was deafening. And one of those pieces, Maggie continued with deadly calm, is currently in Mr. Richard Sterling's private collection. That Persian statuette you bought in 2010 and display so proudly in your office. All eyes turned to Richard, who was literally shaking. How do you know about my private collection? Maggie smiled coldly. Mr. Sterling, I've been cleaning your office for 5 years. Do you think I never noticed the small Persian label on the base of the statuette? Do you think I didn't recognize the piece described in this document? Dr. Rodriguez was completely fascinated. Ma'am, this is extraordinary. Your analysis not only solves the import problem, but reveals a network of illegal trade that lasted decades. Richard tried one last desperate defense. Even if all this is true, this doesn't prove she can translate the complete document. Maggie laughed softly. Mr. Sterling, I've already translated the complete document, including the parts you didn't even know existed. What parts? Dr. Wilson asked. Maggie turned the parchment over, revealing text on the back. The reverse contains a detailed inventory with period values, authentication methods, and even instructions for identifying forgeries. Dr. Rodriguez examined the reverse and was speechless. I hadn't even noticed there was text here too. And there's more, Maggie continued. Hidden in the margins, using sympathetic ink, visible only under certain light conditions, there's a map indicating where some pieces were hidden during Ottoman invasions. She held the document against the window light at a specific angle, revealing almost invisible marks that form geographical symbols. Richard collapsed in a chair. How is it possible for a janitor to know all this? Maggie looked at him with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. Mr. Sterling, it's time to discover who I really am. Maggie carefully placed the document on the table and turned to face the room full of employees. For 5 years, she had been invisible to these people, just another janitor among many. But now, for the first time, all eyes were fixed on her. Dr. Rodriguez, she addressed the specialist respectfully, may I ask you a technical question? Dr. Rodriguez, still in shock from the demonstration of knowledge, nodded. Of course, please. In your initial analysis of the document, you identified the presence of 3 different languages. Could you specify which ones? Well, Classical Arabic, obviously, some passages in Persian and what I suspected to be Ottoman Turkish, but... Maggie smiled gently. Actually, there are 7 different languages. Besides the 3 you mentioned, there are passages in Classical Armenian, Byzantine Greek, Medieval Hebrew, and even some words in Coptic. Dr. Rodriguez went pale. 7 languages. How is it possible to identify all this? When you spend your life studying medieval manuscripts from the Middle East, you develop an eye for these nuances, Maggie replied modestly. Richard, who had remained quiet for a few minutes, exploded. Stop this conversation! Who are you? Anyway, how does a janitor know 7 languages? Maggie took a deep breath. It was the moment she had imagined thousands of times during 5 years of silent humiliations. My full name is Margaret Lucia O'Sullivan Avedisian, she began calmly. I hold a PhD in applied linguistics from Columbia University, with a specialization in ancient Semitic languages from Oxford University. The silence in the room was absolute. Jennifer dropped the pen she was holding. Dr. Wilson opened and closed his mouth several times without being able to make a sound. Dr. Rodriguez looked at her with growing recognition. Avedisian. Margaret Avedisian. My God, you're the Margaret Avedisian. Do you know me? Maggie asked, surprised. I know your work. Your thesis on dialectal variations in Ottoman Commercial Arabic is a reference in the field. I cite your studies in my classes. Richard looked from one to the other, as if they were speaking in an alien language. What are you talking about? Dr. Rodriguez turned to Richard with an expression of absolute incredulity. Richard, this woman is one of the greatest specialists in ancient Oriental languages in America. She published dozens of articles, supervised doctoral theses, gave conferences at universities worldwide. Maggie smiled sadly. That was a long time ago, Dr. Rodriguez. But how? Dr. Rodriguez gestured, confused. How did you end up working as a janitor? Maggie completed. It's a long story. Richard was completely lost. Wait a minute. You're telling me I've had a PhD working as a janitor for 5 years? Had, Maggie corrected calmly, because after today's demonstration, I believe our working relationship has changed substantially. Dr. Wilson finally found his voice. Dr. Maggie, forgive the question, but Why were you working as a janitor? Maggie hesitated. It was the most painful part of the story. In 2019, I discovered irregularities in a colleague's research at the university. He was falsifying translations of ancient manuscripts to support theories without scientific basis. And what happened? Dr. Henry asked. I reported it to the University Ethics Board, Maggie replied simply. I presented evidence, documented the falsifications, followed all ethical protocols. And then? Maggie laughed bitterly. Then I discovered that the colleague in question was the dean's brother-in-law and was about to publish a book that would bring great prestige to the university. My complaint was filed for lack of evidence. Dr. Rodriguez shook his head sadly. Academic politics can be very cruel. Worse than that, Maggie continued, the colleague in question launched a campaign to discredit me. He spread rumors about my competence, questioned my integrity, isolated me from other researchers. My God, Jennifer whispered. In 6 months, I was without research projects, without students, without university support. In a year, I had to resign. Maggie looked directly at Richard. At 53 years old, I discovered that nobody wanted to hire a problematic researcher. Richard was visibly uncomfortable. But why didn't you say who you were when you came to work here? Maggie smiled with irony. I did. In my job interview, I mentioned my background. The response was that I was overqualified for the position and would probably not stay very long. And you stayed 5 years, Dr. Wilson murmured. I stayed because I needed to work, because even with a PhD and international specializations, nobody was willing to give me a second academic chance. Maggie paused. And because I learned that sometimes it's necessary to accept temporary humiliation to survive. Dr. Rodriguez was clearly emotional. Dr. Maggie, this is a terrible injustice. Your contribution to linguistics is invaluable. Thank you, Doctor, Maggie replied with dignity, but I'm not telling this to seek pity. I'm telling this to explain why I know how to translate this document. Richard, still trying to process the revelation, stammered, But then, the bet. Maggie smiled with a satisfaction that had been repressed for 5 long years. Oh yes, the bet. You wagered your jet and your Lamborghini that I couldn't translate the document. I didn't know you were a doctor, Maggie interrupted. Does that change anything? 5 minutes ago, you were certain that a semi-literate janitor couldn't perform this task. Now that you know my background, the bet doesn't count anymore. The silence in the room was charged with tension. Everyone waited for Richard's response, but he seemed incapable of forming coherent words. Maggie continued implacably. For 5 years, I heard comments about my intelligence, my education, my capacity. For 5 years, I was treated as if I were invisible, incompetent, irrelevant. She looked around the room, making eye contact with several employees who lowered their eyes, ashamed. Today, I finally had the opportunity to show who I really am, and I discovered that this completely changes how you see me. Maggie smiled coldly. How revealing. Dr. Rodriguez approached Maggie with a mixture of respect and professional curiosity. Dr. Maggie, if you permit me, I'd like to better understand your analysis of the document. Your discoveries about the marginal annotations and the text on the reverse. They're truly extraordinary. Maggie nodded graciously. Of course, Doctor. Actually, there are even more details that might interest the company. Richard, still in shock, tried to regain some control of the situation. Wait, even if you are a doctor, that doesn't change the fact that... That what, Mr. Sterling? Maggie interrupted with an authority he had never seen in her. That... Richard stammered, clearly without knowing how to finish the sentence in a way that wouldn't make him look even worse than he already did. Dr. Rodriguez saved Richard from momentary embarrassment. Dr. Maggie, you mentioned that there's information that could transform this 50 million problem into a 200 million opportunity. Could you elaborate? Maggie smiled. With pleasure. But first, I need everyone to understand the real situation of this collection. She took a sheet of paper and began drawing a diagram. The 47 pieces listed in the original document have been divided over the centuries into 5 distinct categories. As she spoke, she drew with the precision of someone who had spent decades studying this type of material. First category, 23 pieces that became religious waqf. These are untouchable. They cannot be purchased for any price. Second category, 12 pieces that remained with the Al-Damashqi family but have been in illegal possession for a year. These need to return to the original heirs. Dr. Wilson was taking notes, frantically. And the other 12? Third category, 8 pieces that were legally sold by the Safavids and are now in European museum collections. These are inaccessible. Fourth category, 3 pieces that were illegally smuggled to America, one of which is in Mr. Sterling's private collection. Richard swallowed hard, but said nothing. And the 5th category, Maggie paused dramatically, 1 piece that completely disappeared from historical records. Dr. Henry frowned. That only adds up to 47 pieces. Where's the 200 million opportunity? Maggie smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had saved the best for last. The opportunity lies in what the current seller doesn't know about Mirza Reza's annotations. She pointed to the almost invisible annotations in the document's margin. Mirza Reza wasn't just a merchant. He was what we'd call today an authentication consultant. He tracked fake pieces and discovered lost items. And? Richard asked involuntarily. And his annotations reveal that the original collection of 47 pieces was actually just a small part of a much larger treasure, Maggie explained. Mahmud ibn Abdullah al-Tujjar owned more than 300 antiquities, but only listed 47 in the contract because they were the only ones he was certain he could deliver immediately. Dr. Rodriguez was fascinated. You're saying there are more than 250 undocumented pieces? Exactly. And Mirza Reza spent decades tracking these phantom pieces. His annotations include a detailed map of where 73 of these pieces were hidden during the Safavid invasions of 1603. Dr. Wilson almost spilled his coffee. A treasure map? Is this real? Maggie laughed. It's not exactly a treasure map like in pirate movies. It's a meticulous historical record of where valuable items were hidden for protection during war periods. She took the original document and held it against the window light at a specific angle. Look here. These marks that seem like defects in the parchment are actually a coordinate system based on 17th century geographical landmarks. Everyone approached to see. The almost invisible marks formed patterns that, once identified, clearly represented geographical symbols. Incredible, Dr. Rodriguez murmured. How did you identify this? Forensic analysis technique for ancient documents, Maggie explained. I learned it during my studies at Oxford. Many medieval manuscripts contain hidden information visible only under specific lighting conditions. Richard was completely lost. But where would these pieces be today? Maggie consulted her notes. According to Mirza Reza, 31 of the 73 pieces were recovered by the Ottomans and are now part of the Topkapı Museum collection in Istanbul. Another 19 were found by British archaeologists in the 19th century and are in the British Museum. And the other 23? Dr. Wilson asked. Maggie smiled with an almost feline satisfaction. They're still where they were hidden, and 3 of the hiding places are in territory that today belongs to Syria, but were accessible before the current war. This is fantastic, Dr. Henry exclaimed. But how does this help us? Because, Maggie explained patiently, I can decipher the coordinates, and because I have contacts in the international archaeological community who can organize legal recovery expeditions. Dr. Rodriguez looked at her with growing admiration. Dr. Maggie, are you suggesting an archaeological expedition? I'm suggesting a scientific partnership, Maggie corrected. The company finances the expedition. Universities provide archaeological expertise, and any discovery is divided according to international heritage agreements. And the estimated value? Richard asked, his voice hoarse with anxiety. Maggie did some mental calculations. Based on current market values for authenticated antiquities from the period, and considering we'd be talking about pieces with documented provenance, easily $200 million, possibly more. The silence in the room was absolute. Everyone was processing the magnitude of what Maggie had revealed. But there's one condition, Maggie added calmly. What? Richard asked immediately. Maggie looked directly into his eyes. I want to lead the project as an expert consultant, not as a janitor. The proposal hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Richard realized that his decision would define not only the company's future, but also whether he'd have to honor the most expensive bet of his life. Richard looked at Maggie as if seeing her for the first time. For 5 years, she had been a ghost in his office, an invisible presence who emptied trash cans and cleaned surfaces. Now, suddenly, she was the most important person in the room. Maggie? Dr. Maggie, he corrected embarrassedly. Are you saying you can map locations of archaeological treasures based on 400-year-old annotations? Not treasures, Mr. Sterling, Maggie corrected patiently. Antiquities with documented historical and commercial value. And yes, I can not only map the locations, but also coordinate the expeditions to recover them. Dr. Rodriguez was clearly fascinated. Dr. Maggie, what are your contacts in the international archaeological community? Maggie smiled modestly. During my research years, I collaborated with various institutions. Dr. James Morrison from Oxford, Dr. Sarah Al-Hassan from the American University of Beirut, Professor Giuseppe Verdi from the University of Rome. Wait, Dr. Wilson interrupted. You personally know these names? I do, Maggie confirmed. Actually, Dr. Morrison invited me to co-lead an expedition in Syria in 2018, but I had to decline due to the events that brought me here. Richard was doing frantic calculations. If you can locate these antiquities, if the value really is 200 million, this would completely transform the company's situation. More than that, Maggie added, the scientific prestige of such a discovery would attract international investors, partnerships with museums, consulting contracts. She paused. Sterling Holdings could become a world leader in historical heritage recovery. Dr. Henry was visibly excited. Richard, do you realize the opportunity being offered? But Maggie wasn't finished. There's still another aspect you need to consider. What? Richard asked, already anticipating more surprising revelations. Maggie pulled a simple cell phone from her pocket. During these 5 years, I systematically documented all the irregularities I observed in this company. Richard's blood ran cold. What irregularities? Well, let me see. Maggie began scrolling through her phone with the calm of someone who had prepared for this moment for a long time. Underreporting of imports to reduce taxes, use of shell companies for money laundering, bribing of IRS officials. How do you know these things? Richard stammered, pale as a ghost. Maggie smiled coldly. Mr. Sterling, I cleaned your office. I emptied your trash. I organized your documents. Do you think I was blind and deaf as well as stupid? The observation cut through the air like a blade. Several employees lowered their eyes, embarrassed. Richard was turning red with anger and nervousness. "But here's the crucial point," Maggie continued, pointing to a specific section of the document. "I photographed documents, recorded conversations, maintained detailed records," Maggie replied calmly, "all perfectly legal, since I was in the exercise of my cleaning duties." Richard was shaking now. "What do you want?" Maggie looked at him with an indecipherable expression. "I want you to understand exactly who you're dealing with. For 5 years, I was treated as an inferior, ignorant, irrelevant person. But I was observing, learning, documenting. Are you blackmailing us?" Dr. Henry asked. "No," Maggie replied serenely. "I'm offering a mutually beneficial partnership. You give me the position and respect I deserve, and I transform this company into an international archaeological recovery powerhouse." "And if we refuse?" Richard asked with a trembling voice. Maggie smiled with an icy satisfaction. "Then you honor the bet you made. Give me the jet and the Lamborghini, and I take my information and expertise to your competitors." Dr. Rodriguez intervened diplomatically. "Dr. Maggie, what exactly would be your partnership proposal?" Maggie had clearly thought through every detail. "First condition, public recognition of my qualifications and a position as Director of Historical Heritage at the company. Second condition, a budget of $10 million for archaeological expeditions under my technical supervision. Third condition, 20% participation in profits from any archaeological discovery coordinated by me. And the fourth condition," she paused dramatically, "Mr. Richard Sterling makes a public apology to me and all employees who have been treated with disrespect at this company." The silence in the room was deafening. Richard looked at Maggie as if she were an alien who had just landed in his office. You planned all this," he finally murmured. Maggie smiled. "Mr. Sterling, I have a PhD in linguistics, not in business strategy. But 5 years of humiliation taught me to be very, very patient." Dr. Wilson approached hesitantly. "Dr. Maggie, your conditions are quite specific." "They're fair," Maggie corrected. "Considering I can transform a 50 million crisis into a 200 million opportunity, plus resolve all the company's legal problems with tax authorities." Richard swallowed hard. "How would you resolve the tax problems?" Maggie laughed softly. "Simple. Voluntary disclosure of irregularities, payment of negotiated fines, and transformation of the company into an international compliance model." She paused. "Something I could personally coordinate, given my detailed knowledge of the situation." The proposal was simultaneously a lifeline and complete humiliation for Richard. He realized he was completely at the mercy of the woman he had despised for 5 consecutive years. "And if I accept your conditions?" he asked, defeated. Maggie smiled with a mixture of satisfaction and magnanimity. "Then we transform this company into an international example of how to treat employees with respect and how to recover historical heritage ethically." The choice was clear: accept Maggie's conditions or face complete ruin of the company and possibly criminal consequences. But Maggie had one more revelation that would change everything. She looked around the room filled with employees and realized they all deserved to know the complete truth about her story. For 5 years, she had been a silent enigma. Now it was time to reveal the entire truth. "Before you make a decision," she said calmly, "I believe you deserve to know exactly who I am and how I got here." The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone sensed that they were about to hear something that would change their understanding of everything they thought they knew about the quiet janitor who had worked among them for 5 years. "Dr. Rodriguez," Maggie addressed the specialist, "if it's not an indiscretion, I imagine you'd like to understand my trajectory. My academic work simply disappeared from the scientific community a few years ago. Dr. Rodriguez nodded respectfully. I would indeed, Dr. Maggie. Your research was groundbreaking in the field. Maggie took a deep breath. It's a story of ideals versus interests, Dr. Rodriguez, a story that many academics prefer not to tell. She sat in one of the boardroom chairs for the first time in 5 years, not as a submissive employee, but as a specialist, being consulted. I was born in Boston, daughter of Armenian immigrants, she began. My parents came to America fleeing persecution in Turkey. At home, we spoke Armenian, Turkish, and English. Richard, still in shock, asked, "How does this explain you knowing Arabic and Persian?" Maggie smiled nostalgically. My grandfather was a polyglot. Besides native Armenian, he spoke Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Greek, and French, languages necessary to survive in the Ottoman Empire. He taught me that knowledge is the only wealth nobody can steal. The revelation hung in the air as everyone waited to hear the rest of this extraordinary story that was unfolding before their eyes. I was a precocious child, Maggie continued. At 12, I was already helping translate documents for other immigrants in the community. At 16, I mastered 7 languages. At 18, I got a full scholarship to study linguistics at Columbia. Dr. Wilson was fascinated. And how did you get into Oriental languages? During undergrad, I discovered the manuscripts at the Morgan Library, ancient documents in Arabic, Persian, Ottoman, Turkish that had never been translated. Maggie paused. It was love at first sight. Each manuscript was a historical puzzle waiting to be deciphered. At 25, I published my first translation, a 12th century Islamic medicine manual that revolutionized understanding of medieval medical practices. At 28, I was defending my PhD with a thesis on commercial variations of Ottoman Arabic. Dr. Rodriguez nodded respectfully. Your thesis is still cited today in graduate courses. Oxford offered me a postdoc, Maggie continued. 2 years studying manuscripts at the Bodleian Library, collaborating with the world's greatest specialists. It was the happiest period of my academic life. And then? Jennifer asked timidly. Maggie laughed bitterly. I returned to the US in 2005 full of plans. I wanted to create the first American Center for Oriental Manuscript Studies. I got research funding, assembled a team, established international partnerships. For a decade, our team translated hundreds of historical documents. We discovered lost medical recipes, mapped ancient trade routes, revealed historical connections between civilizations. Maggie looked through the window. We were a world reference. Richard was visibly uncomfortable. What went wrong? In 2018, we received a collection of manuscripts for authentication. They were supposedly 16th century commercial documents, very valuable. Maggie paused. I discovered they were sophisticated forgeries. Dr. Henry frowned. Forgeries? Someone had created fake documents using ancient parchment and period inks, but making anachronistic errors in language and historical references, Maggie explained. To a layperson, they looked authentic. To a specialist, they were obviously fake. And then I discovered that the collector was the dean's brother-in-law, and that authenticating the manuscripts would guarantee a $20 million bank loan for the university. Maggie smiled sadly. I was being pressured to sign false reports. Dr. Rodriguez shook his head. And you refused? Of course I refused. My scientific integrity is worth more than any amount. Maggie looked directly at Richard. Some values are priceless. What happened next? Dr. Wilson asked. I reported the forgeries to the university's ethics board. I presented detailed analyses proving the documents were fraudulent. Maggie paused. The response was that I was being excessively technical and should consider the greater good of the institution. "They asked you to ignore the fraud," Jennifer asked indignantly. "More than that, the dean called me personally and said I was harming the future of hundreds of students because of unnecessary perfectionism." Maggie laughed bitterly, as if scientific integrity were perfectionism. Richard was clearly uncomfortable with the obvious parallels. "And you maintained your position?" "I did. I published a scientific article exposing the forgeries with detailed technical analyses." Maggie looked at him. "It was my academic death sentence." "How so?" "The dean launched a systematic campaign to discredit me. He spread rumors about my emotional instability, questioned my competence, isolated me from colleagues." Maggie paused. "In 6 months, I was without projects, without students, without institutional support." Dr. Rodriguez was visibly emotional. "This is a terrible injustice. In 2019, I had to resign from the university. At 53, I discovered I was a burned academic. Nobody wanted to associate with me for fear of retaliation." Maggie looked around the room. "For a year, I sent resumes to universities, research institutes, consulting firms. I always received polite responses saying I was overqualified." "And how did you end up here?" Dr. Wilson asked. Maggie smiled ironically. "An employment agency told me they had an opportunity for someone with my profile. I thought it was an academic consultancy." She paused. "It was a janitor position." The silence in the room was heavy with embarrassment. "At first, I thought about refusing, a PhD in linguistics with international specialization, working as a janitor." Maggie shook her head. "But I needed to pay bills. I needed to eat." "And you accepted?" Richard murmured. "I accepted. In the interview, I mentioned my academic background, hoping they'd value my education even for simple work." Maggie looked directly at Richard. The response was that I was exaggerating and that simple people sometimes invent grandiose stories. Richard swallowed hard, clearly remembering the conversation. "For 5 years, I cleaned bathrooms, emptied trash cans, mopped floors." Maggie paused. "And for 5 years, I heard comments about my supposed ignorance, my incapacity, my intellectual inferiority." "You never said anything?" Jennifer asked. "What would be the point? Who would believe a janitor saying she was a doctor?" Maggie laughed sadly. "I learned that society judges people by the function they perform, not by the capacity they possess." "But why did you stay so long?" Dr. Henry asked. Maggie looked at him with profound wisdom. "Because I realized I was in a unique position. I was invisible, but I observed everything. I was ignored, but I heard everything." She smiled. "And because I knew that one day I'd have the opportunity to show who I really was." Richard was completely pale now. You planned all this?" Maggie laughed softly. "No, Mr. Sterling. I just prepared myself. I kept my knowledge current, continued studying, waiting for the right opportunity." She paused. "The opportunity you gave me today with your absurd bet." Dr. Rodriguez shook his head admiringly. "Dr. Maggie, your story is both inspiring and terrible." Maggie smiled with recovered dignity. "It's the story of a person who refused to give up on herself, even when the world gave up on her." She looked directly at Richard. "And now, Mr. Sterling, it's time to decide. Are you going to honor the bet you made, or continue doubting the capacity of a simple janitor?" But before Richard could answer, Maggie pulled out her phone again. "Actually, before you decide, there's something else you should know." "What now?" Richard asked, with growing dread. Maggie showed him an email on her screen. 3 days ago, I received this message from Dr. James Morrison at Oxford." She read aloud, "Dear Maggie, The archaeological expedition in the Aleppo region was an extraordinary success. We discovered 23 pieces that correspond exactly to your predictions based on Ottoman manuscripts. The estimated value of the discovery is $180 million. Dr. Wilson almost dropped his coffee. You predicted archaeological discoveries. Maggie smiled modestly. In 2019, before the problems at the university, I had begun mapping locations of lost treasures using manuscripts similar to the one I translated today. I shared some coordinates with colleagues at Oxford. And they found the treasures? Dr. Henry asked incredulously. Maggie continued reading. Maggie, you need to return to academia. Your contributions are invaluable. We offer you a visiting professor position at Oxford with your own laboratory and a $2 million research budget. The silence in the room was absolute. Richard was staring at the screen as if seeing a mirage. Maggie continued, P.S. The British Museum is interested in funding an expedition led by you in Syria based on your research on Ottoman commercial manuscripts. Available funding, $15 million. Dr. Rodriguez was speechless. Dr. Maggie, you have a job offer at Oxford, and you're here cleaning offices. Maggie looked at him with an indecipherable expression. I received this email 3 days ago. I was preparing my response when today's opportunity arose. Richard found his voice, though it came out as a whisper. Why didn't you accept Oxford's offer? Maggie turned to him with a smile that was simultaneously gentle and implacable. Because I discovered something interesting in the last 5 years, Mr. Sterling. I discovered that I prefer working with people who respect me for my ability, not for my position. The revelation hung in the air as Richard realized the full magnitude of the situation he had created with his arrogant bet. Maggie clicked to the next slide on her phone. It was a detailed proposal for creating an American Center for Historical Heritage Recovery. I spent the last 2 years developing a project to transform America into a world power in archaeology and antiquity recovery, Maggie explained. The project envisions partnerships with international universities, joint funding of expeditions, and ethical division of discoveries. What's the estimated value of the project? Dr. Wilson asked. Initial investment, $50 million. Projected return in the first 5 years, $800 million. Maggie paused. And incalculable international prestige for America. Richard was doing frantic calculations. You're offering my company the chance to lead this project? I'm offering a choice, Maggie corrected. You can give me the keys to the jet and Lamborghini, and I take this project to Oxford. Or you can offer me a real partnership, and we build something extraordinary here in America. Dr. Henry approached the screen. Maggie, Dr. Maggie, is this project real, viable? Maggie smiled. Doctor, I have letters of support from UNESCO, the Louvre Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of New York, and the Tokyo National Museum, all interested in partnerships. She clicked to show the official letters. What was missing was an American partner with sufficient vision and resources to embrace a project of this magnitude. Richard looked at the jet through the window, then at the letters on the screen, then at Maggie. If I accept your partnership proposal, what happens to the bet? Maggie laughed softly. Mr. Sterling, if you give me the opportunity to transform your company into an international powerhouse, I consider that I've received something much more valuable than a jet. And the evidence of tax irregularities? He asked nervously. They'll be used to make a clean voluntary disclosure, payment of negotiated fines, and transformation of the company into a compliance model. Maggie paused. Something I would personally supervise. Dr. Wilson was clearly excited. Richard, do you realize the historic opportunity being offered? Richard looked around the room, seeing the expectant faces of all the employees who had witnessed his humiliation and Maggie's extraordinary revelation. "Maggie. Dr. Maggie?" He finally said, "I need a few hours to process all this." Maggie nodded understandingly. "Of course. But remember, Oxford expects my answer by tomorrow, and the opportunity to lead this project in America might not come again." She headed for the door but stopped halfway. "Oh, Mr. Sterling, one last thing." "Yes?" Maggie smiled with a satisfaction 5 years repressed. "All this time, I never stopped being a doctor. I just worked as a janitor." She paused. "The difference is important." And for the first time in 5 years, Maggie O'Sullivan left the office not pushing a cleaning cart, but carrying the dignity of someone who had finally been recognized for what she had always been, one of the brightest minds that company had ever been lucky enough to employ. But the story was far from over. What happened next would test everyone's character and reveal the true nature of power, respect, and redemption in corporate America. An hour later, Richard was alone in his office, looking alternately at the Arabic document on his desk and at the jet in the window. His mind was working frantically, trying to process everything that had happened. The phone rang. It was his majority partner, Senator Augustus Clark, calling from Washington, D.C. "Richard," the grave voice echoed through the speakerphone, "I heard some strange rumors about your company. Something about problems with document translation and crazy bets?" Richard swallowed hard. "Augustus, I can explain. You bet your private jet on a translation done by a janitor?" Augustus interrupted with incredulity. "Richard, have you completely lost your mind? The situation is more complicated than it seems." "More complicated?" "Richard, I own 40% of the shares in this company. You can't make insane bets without my approval." Augustus was clearly furious. "And now I heard that this janitor has compromising information about our tax operations." Richard felt his stomach sink. "How did you know that?" "I have ears everywhere, Richard, and what I heard left me very worried." Augustus's voice became dangerously low. "Do you know what kind of problems a tax investigation could cause for me? For both of us?" Richard began to sweat. Senator Augustus Clark wasn't just his partner, he was an influential senator with dangerous connections. "Augustus, Maggie won't report anything. She wants to make a partnership." "Maggie," Augustus exploded. "You're calling a blackmailing janitor by her first name now? Richard, you've completely lost your sense of reality. She's not a common janitor. She's a doctor in linguistics, specialist in ancient manuscripts. I don't care if she's Einstein reincarnated," Augustus bellowed. "She has information that could destroy our partnership, and you want to give her a position of power in the company. Are you insane?" Richard tried to defend himself. "Augustus, the opportunities she offers are extraordinary. We're talking about hundreds of millions." "Richard, listen carefully to what I'm going to tell you," Augustus interrupted with a coldness that made Richard tremble. "You have 2 options. Either you solve this problem definitively, or I solve it my way." "What do you mean by solve definitively?" "I mean that people with dangerous information sometimes have accidents. Sometimes they're transferred to very distant locations. Sometimes they simply disappear." The threat was crystal clear. "Do you understand me?" Richard felt his blood freeze. "Augustus, you can't be suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Richard. I'm just reminding you that we have a lot to lose if this information reaches the wrong authorities." Augustus paused, "and that I have resources to protect our interests." The call ended, leaving Richard in a state of panic. He had known Augustus for 15 years and knew his threats were never empty. At that moment, Maggie knocked on the door. "Mr. Sterling, may I come in?" Richard tried to hide his nervousness. "Maggie, of course, come in." Maggie immediately noticed his agitation. "Is everything all right? You look nervous." "I'm just Just processing all the day's information. Richard lied poorly. Maggie sat in front of his desk with the confidence of someone who knew she was in an advantageous position. I came to see if you've made a decision about my proposal. Richard looked at her with a mixture of fear and desperation. Maggie, I need to ask something. The information you have about the company, have you already shared it with anyone? Maggie frowned. Why do you ask? It's important. Did you make copies? Send them to anyone? Maggie studied his expression carefully. Mr. Sterling, you seem worried about something beyond our negotiation. Richard tried to stay calm. I just want to understand the scope of the situation. Maggie smiled slowly. Actually, yes. I made several copies of everything and stored them in safe places. She paused. And I also prepared a detailed letter explaining the entire situation, including our conversation today. A letter? With instructions to be opened if something happens to me, Maggie explained calmly. I learned during my academic career that people with valuable information sometimes face unexpected pressures. Richard felt like he had been punched in the stomach. Maggie, why would you do that? Because, Mr. Sterling, for 5 years I heard many interesting conversations while cleaning this office. Conversations about solving problems, about people who know too much, about convenient accidents. Maggie looked directly into his eyes. I learned to be cautious. Richard was sweating profusely now. You heard conversations about that? Maggie stood up and walked to the window. I heard conversations between you and Senator Clark. Many conversations. For 5 years. Richard's world completely collapsed. What are you going to do with this information? Maggie turned to him with a serene expression. Mr. Sterling, I don't want to destroy you. I never did. I just want the opportunity to do the work I love with the respect I deserve. But if something happens to you, if something happens to me, several very interesting people will receive very detailed information about this company's operations and your senatorial partner. Maggie smiled coldly, including investigative journalists, federal prosecutors, and international human rights organizations. Richard collapsed in his chair. Maggie, You have a simple choice, Maggie interrupted. You can give me the opportunity to transform this company into something respectable and profitable, or you can discover what happens when you try to silence people who prepared adequately. She walked to the door, but stopped before leaving. Oh, Mr. Sterling, Oxford's deadline is this afternoon. If I don't respond by 6 p.m., they'll consider that I accepted the offer. Maggie smiled one last time. Choose wisely. After Maggie left, Richard sat alone in his office, staring at his phone. He knew he had to call Augustus back, but he also knew the conversation would be explosive. The phone rang before he could decide. Augustus again. Richard, I've been thinking about our conversation. The senator's voice was dangerously calm. I think you misunderstood the gravity of the situation. Augustus, listen. No, you listen, Augustus interrupted. I have contacts in the IRS, FBI, and DOJ. I know exactly what kind of investigation this woman could trigger with the right information. Richard felt sick. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that this problem needs to disappear permanently. Augustus paused. And I have people who specialize in making problems disappear. You can't be serious. Richard, I'm running for re-election next year. I have presidential ambitions. I cannot have a tax evasion scandal destroying my career. Augustus's voice was ice cold. Do you understand the position you've put me in? Richard was trembling. Augustus, she's offering to help us. She wants to regularize everything. She's a threat, Richard. Today she wants a directorship, tomorrow she wants the entire company, next week she's testifying before Congress. Augustus exploded. People like this never stop with the first blackmail. But the archaeological project, the 200 million opportunity. Richard, you're being naive. This is clearly an elaborate scam. A janitor with a PhD. Ancient treasure maps. Come on. Augustus laughed sarcastically. She's playing you like a violin. Richard felt confused, but Dr. Rodriguez confirmed her knowledge. Rodriguez is probably part of the scam. Or he's been fooled too. Augustus was getting more agitated. Richard, I'm sending some people to New York tonight. They'll resolve this situation discreetly. What kind of people? The kind that make sure problematic individuals have unfortunate accidents. Augustus paused menacingly. Car accidents are so common in New York traffic. Richard felt like he was going to vomit. Augustus, you can't. She's an innocent person. Innocent? Augustus screamed. She's blackmailing us. She's threatening to destroy everything we built. His voice became deadly quiet. Richard, you have until midnight to convince her to disappear voluntarily. After that, my people take over. The line went dead. Richard sat in his chair, paralyzed with fear. He had always known Augustus was ruthless in business, but this was the first time he'd heard explicit threats of violence. His hands shook as he tried to think of a solution. Call the police. They'd investigate the company and discover the tax irregularities. Warn Maggie? She might disappear and take her information to the authorities. The intercom buzzed. Mr. Sterling? Jennifer's voice was hesitant. Dr. Maggie is here to see you again. Richard's blood froze. Send her in. Maggie entered with the same calm confidence, but Richard noticed she was carrying a different bag, a professional leather briefcase, instead of her usual cleaning supplies. Mr. Sterling, she said, sitting down without being invited, I came to give you one more piece of information before you make your decision. What information? Richard asked weakly. Maggie opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. During my 5 years here, I wasn't just documenting your company's irregularities. I was also investigating your partner, Senator Clark. Richard felt the room spin. What do you mean? I mean that a linguistics expert who specializes in document authentication has some very interesting skills. Maggie smiled. For example, I can tell when signatures are forged, when documents are backdated, when financial records are falsified. She opened the folder, revealing dozens of photocopied documents. Senator Clark has been using your company as a front for much more serious activities than tax evasion. What activities? Arms trafficking to conflict zones, money laundering for drug cartels, financing of extremist groups. Maggie listed calmly. All documented with forged signatures and falsified records that I can prove are fraudulent. Richard was speechless. The senator thinks I'm just a janitor with some tax information, Maggie continued. He has no idea that I've been analyzing his criminal network for 5 years, building an airtight case that could send him to federal prison for life. Why are you telling me this? Maggie looked at him with something that might have been compassion. Because I believe you're more of a fool than a criminal, Mr. Sterling. You got involved with the wrong person and now you're trapped. What do you want me to do? I want you to choose which side of history you want to be on, Maggie said firmly. You can continue being Senator Clark's puppet and face the consequences when his criminal empire collapses. Or you can partner with me, help bring him to justice, and transform your company into something legitimate. Richard stared at her in shock. You're asking me to betray my partner? I'm asking you to save your own life, Maggie replied, because when the senator's network is exposed, and it will be, Everyone associated with him will fall. The only question is whether you'll fall as an accomplice or as a cooperating witness. The weight of the decision was crushing. Richard realized that the simple bet about a document translation had evolved into a choice that would determine the rest of his life. "How much time do I have?" he asked weakly. Maggie looked at her watch. "The senator's people are probably already on their way to New York. I'd say you have about 2 hours to decide whether you want to be my partner or my next target for investigation." She stood up and headed for the door. "Choose carefully, Mr. Sterling. This is the last choice you'll make as a free man." At 5:45 p.m., Richard was in the boardroom with all employees gathered again. His decision had been the most difficult of his life, but also the most obvious. Maggie entered punctually, carrying a leather briefcase, no longer the cleaning cart that had accompanied her for 5 years. "Mr. Sterling," she said calmly, "have you reached a decision?" Richard stood up, clearly emotional. To everyone's surprise, he began speaking with a humility nobody had ever seen in him. "Maggie, Dr. Margaret O'Sullivan," he said publicly for the first time, "for 5 years I made a terrible mistake. I treated you as if you were invisible, ignorant, worthless." The employees looked at each other, surprised by the radical change in Richard's behavior. "Today, I discovered that the person I respected least in this company was actually the most qualified, most ethical, and most visionary among all of us." Richard paused, clearly struggling with his emotions. "And that my prejudice blinded me to an extraordinary opportunity." Maggie remained serene, but there was deep satisfaction in her eyes. "Therefore," Richard continued, "I want to make a public apology to you and to all employees who have been treated with disrespect at this company." He looked around the room. "Everyone deserves dignity, regardless of their function." Spontaneous applause echoed through the room. Jennifer had tears in her eyes. Dr. Wilson was smiling openly. "As for your partnership proposal," Richard continued, "I accept your conditions entirely. You will be our new Director of Historical Heritage, with full budget for archaeological expeditions." Maggie nodded graciously. "And the bet?" Richard smiled, for the first time, genuinely. "I consider that I received something much more valuable than a jet. I received the chance to transform this company into something I can be proud of." "But there's one condition," Maggie said, surprising everyone. "What?" Maggie smiled. "I want my first project to be creating a scholarship program for employees' children, using part of the resources from archaeological expeditions." Richard was visibly moved. "Why?" "Because education is the only wealth nobody can steal," Maggie quoted her grandfather's words. "And because I want to ensure that no child has to clean bathrooms with a PhD just to survive." The applause this time was deafening. Employees stood up, some crying openly. But Maggie wasn't finished with her revelations. "There's one more thing everyone should know," she said, her voice cutting through the applause. The room fell silent again. "An hour ago, I received a phone call from the FBI," Maggie announced calmly. Richard felt his knees buckle. "The FBI? Agent Sarah Martinez from the Financial Crimes Division. Apparently, they've been investigating Senator Clark's activities for 2 years." Maggie looked directly at Richard. "They know about the money laundering, the arms trafficking, everything." Dr. Henry was pale. "What does this mean for the company?" "It means," Maggie continued, "that everyone associated with the senator is under investigation, including Sterling Holdings and its executives." Richard was shaking. Are we going to be arrested?" Maggie smiled with an expression that was simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. "That depends on the choices made in the next few hours." "What did you tell the FBI?" I told them I was prepared to cooperate fully with their investigation, Maggie replied. I offered to turn over all the documentation I collected over 5 years, plus my analysis of the senator's forged documents. Richard felt faint. And what did they say? They said they're very interested in my cooperation, especially because they need someone who can authenticate the forged documents in the senator's files. Maggie paused. Apparently, they've been looking for a linguistic expert who could prove the documents are fraudulent. Dr. Rodriguez, who had been silent, spoke up. Dr. Maggie, you're saying you can help the FBI build a case against the senator? I'm saying I already built the case, Maggie corrected. 5 years of systematic documentation, linguistic analysis of forged signatures, chronological mapping of illegal transactions. She opened her briefcase and showed thick folders. Everything is here. Richard was having trouble breathing. What happens to me? To the company? Maggie looked at him with something that might have been compassion. Agent Martinez said that cooperating witnesses receive full immunity and protection. Non-cooperating witnesses, she shrugged. Well, they face the full weight of federal law. You're giving me a chance to cooperate? I'm giving you a chance to choose the right side, Maggie corrected. The senator is going down, Mr. Sterling. The only question is whether you go down with him or help put him away. Dr. Wilson asked hesitantly, what would cooperation involve? Full disclosure of all illegal activities, return of laundered money, testimony against the senator, and transformation of the company into a model of legal compliance. Maggie paused. Plus, of course, honoring our archaeological partnership agreement. Richard looked around the room at his employees' faces. For the first time in years, he saw them not as subordinates, but as people whose lives would be affected by his decision. If I cooperate, what guarantees do I have? You have my word, Maggie said simply, and you have the word of the FBI that cooperating witnesses receive protection. And if I don't cooperate? Maggie's expression became completely neutral. Then, in about an hour, several FBI agents will arrive here with search warrants. Senator Clark's people will also arrive, probably around the same time. She paused. It would be very unfortunate if you were caught between federal agents and the senator's problem solvers. The threat was clear but not explicit. Richard realized that Maggie was offering him one last chance to save himself. How much time do I have to decide? Maggie looked at her watch. Agent Martinez is waiting for my call. I told her I'd contact her by 6 p.m. with information about potential cooperating witnesses. 15 minutes, Richard calculated. 15 minutes to decide the rest of your life, Maggie confirmed. She stood up and walked to the door. Mr. Sterling, I'm going to wait in Dr. Rodriguez's office. When you're ready to make the right choice, you know where to find me. As Maggie left, Richard looked through the window at his jet and Lamborghini. 12 hours ago, those possessions had defined his success. Now they seemed like toys compared to the choice between freedom and federal prison. He picked up the phone to call Agent Martinez. It was time to choose which side of the law he wanted to be on. At exactly 6:12 p.m., the Sterling Holdings building was surrounded by black SUVs. Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI Financial Crimes Division walked into the lobby with a team of 6 agents, all wearing bulletproof vests under their dark suits. Richard was in his office when Jennifer burst through the door, pale as paper. "Mr. Sterling, the FBI is here. They're coming up." Richard felt his world collapse. He looked through the window and saw more agents positioning themselves around the building. "Where's Maggie?" "In Dr. Rodriguez's office, like she said." Richard ran down the hallway just as Agent Martinez stepped out of the elevator. She was a woman of about 45, with grey hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. "Mr. Richard Sterling?" she asked, showing her badge. Yes, that's me." "Agent Sarah Martinez, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We need to talk." At that moment, Maggie appeared from Dr. Rodriguez's office. "Agent Martinez, thank you for coming so quickly." Agent Martinez smiled at Maggie with obvious respect. "Dr. O'Sullivan, your information was invaluable. Are you ready to proceed?" Richard looked from one to the other in confusion. "You two know each other?" Agent Martinez turned to Richard. "Dr. O'Sullivan contacted us 3 days ago with information about a criminal network involving tax evasion, money laundering, and international arms trafficking." 3 days ago? Richard was incredulous. "But you only received the email from Oxford 3 days ago." Maggie smiled. "Mr. Sterling, I didn't just receive the email from Oxford 3 days ago. I also made a decision about what to do with 5 years of accumulated evidence." Agent Martinez consulted her tablet. "Dr. O'Sullivan provided us with over 500 pages of documented evidence, including photographs of falsified documents, recordings of incriminating conversations, and linguistic analysis proving forgery." Richard felt faint. "Recordings?" Maggie pulled a small device from her briefcase. "Do you remember this conversation from last Tuesday, Mr. Sterling?" She pressed play. Richard's voice came through clearly. "Augustus, we need to increase the underreporting percentage. The IRS is getting suspicious of the current numbers." Richard's knees buckled. You recorded our phone calls?" "I recorded everything, Mr. Sterling. 5 years of evidence." Maggie looked at him with steely calm. "Including today's conversation where Senator Clark threatened to have me killed." Agent Martinez's expression hardened. "Dr. O'Sullivan played us that recording an hour ago. We already have teams moving to arrest the senator." At that moment, Dr. Rodriguez appeared in the hallway. "What's happening? Here?" Agent Martinez turned to him. "Dr. Rodriguez, we understand you can confirm Dr. O'Sullivan's academic credentials." "Absolutely. She's one of the most respected linguists in the world." Dr. Rodriguez looked confused. "But I don't understand what the FBI—" "Dr. Rodriguez," Maggie interrupted gently, "I wasn't just demonstrating my translation skills today. I was also gathering the final evidence needed to bring down a criminal network." Richard stared at her in shock. Everything today was planned." "Not planned," Maggie corrected, "prepared for. I knew that eventually the senator's criminal activities would need to be exposed. I just didn't know when the opportunity would arise." Agent Martinez consulted her watch. "Dr. O'Sullivan, are you ready to make your formal statement?" "Yes, but first—" Maggie turned to Richard. "I want to give Mr. Sterling one last chance to make the right choice." Richard looked at the FBI agents, then at Maggie, then at his employees who were gathering in the hallway, watching the scene unfold. "What choice do I have?" he asked desperately. "You can cooperate fully with the FBI investigation, accept immunity in exchange for testimony against Senator Clark, and partner with me to transform this company into something legitimate." Maggie paused. "Or you can remain loyal to a criminal who just threatened to have you killed if you became inconvenient." Agent Martinez stepped forward. "Mr. Sterling, I can confirm that the U.S. Attorney's Office is prepared to offer you full immunity in exchange for cooperation, but the offer expires in 5 minutes." Richard looked around at his employees' faces. Jennifer, who had worked for him for 8 years, Dr. Wilson, who had children in college, Dr. Henry, who was about to retire. All of them would lose their jobs if the company collapsed. "If I cooperate," Richard asked, "what happens to my employees?" "The company continues. Operating under new management, Agent Martinez replied. Legitimate business operations are not affected. And Dr. O'Sullivan would be that new management. Maggie spoke for herself. I would be the Director of Historical Heritage, as we discussed. The company would continue with its import-export business, but now focused on legal archaeological recovery. Richard looked through the window at his jet one more time. Then he made the most important decision of his life. Agent Martinez, he said firmly, I accept the immunity offer. I'm ready to cooperate fully with the investigation. Maggie smiled with satisfaction, but not triumph. You made the right choice, Mr. Sterling. There's one more thing, Agent Martinez said. About an hour ago, we arrested 3 individuals who were heading to this building with intent to harm Dr. O'Sullivan. Richard went pale. Augustus's people. Senator Clark's hired criminals, Agent Martinez confirmed. They're already in federal custody. Richard felt a wave of relief mixed with nausea. I could have been an accessory to murder, but you weren't, Maggie said gently. You chose to do the right thing. Dr. Rodriguez, still trying to process everything, asked, Dr. Maggie, how long have you been planning to expose this criminal network? Since my 2nd year here, Maggie replied, when I realized that the company's irregular activities were just the tip of an iceberg involving much more serious crimes. Why didn't you go to the authorities sooner? Maggie looked at him with a sad wisdom. Because who would believe a janitor accusing a U.S. senator and a millionaire businessman? I needed irrefutable evidence and the right moment. Agent Martinez smiled with professional admiration. Dr. O'Sullivan's evidence is so comprehensive that we expect to dismantle one of the largest money laundering networks on the East Coast. Richard slumped in a chair. I almost became an accessory to all this. But you didn't, Maggie repeated firmly. And now you have the chance to build something much better. She pulled out the Oxford email on her phone. By the way, I'm declining Oxford's offer. I have work to do here in America. Dr. Rodriguez was surprised. You're giving up Oxford to stay here? Maggie looked around the room at the employees who had witnessed her transformation from invisible janitor to respected director. I'm choosing to build something new. Something that proves a person's worth isn't determined by their job title, but by their character and capabilities. Agent Martinez closed her tablet. Dr. O'Sullivan, we'll need you at the federal building tomorrow morning for your formal statement. I'll be there, Maggie confirmed. As the FBI agents left, the employees gradually dispersed, but the energy in the building had completely changed. For the first time in years, people felt they were working for something respectable. Richard remained in the boardroom with Maggie. Dr. O'Sullivan, I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet, Maggie replied. We have a lot of work ahead of us to rebuild this company's reputation. The archaeological project. Is it really viable? Maggie smiled. Mr. Sterling, in 3 months you'll see the first results. In a year, Sterling Holdings will be the most respected name in ethical archaeological recovery worldwide. Richard looked at her with genuine admiration for the first time. How can you be so confident? Because I've been preparing for this opportunity for 35 years, Maggie replied, and because I finally have a partner who respects what I can accomplish. The transformation was complete. The arrogant millionaire had become a humbled businessman ready to learn. The invisible janitor had revealed herself as a brilliant academic ready to lead. But the biggest transformation was yet to come. 3 months later, the American Center for Historical Heritage Recovery was a reality. The first expedition, led by Maggie, had discovered 31 antiquities valued at $127 million in a previously unexplored site in Jordan. Sterling Holdings had become a world reference in ethical archaeology, attracting partnerships with the planet's greatest museums. Richard, transformed by the experience, had implemented revolutionary employee appreciation policies. Maggie, now internationally respected again, never forgot her origins. In her luxurious office, she kept a photo of herself in her janitor's uniform, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as a symbol that a person's value isn't defined by their function. The scholarship program had already benefited 200 children. One of them, daughter of a company janitor, had just enrolled in linguistics at Columbia. Dr. Rodriguez visited Maggie in her new office. "Dr. Maggie, how does it feel to be recognized for what you always were?" Maggie looked through the window, seeing employees of various functions working with dignity and mutual respect. "I feel at home, doctor, finally at home." "And don't you feel anger about the lost years?" Maggie smiled serenely. "They weren't lost years. They were years of preparation. I learned that sometimes we need to accept being underestimated so that at the right moment we can show our true value." "And what's the most important lesson from this story?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. Maggie looked at the photo on her desk, herself in a janitor's uniform holding the Arabic document. "That we should never judge people by the position they occupy, but by the potential they carry, and that knowledge and dignity are treasures that no humiliation can steal." On her office wall, framed, was the phrase in Arabic, Persian, and English, "Knowledge is the only wealth nobody can steal." Richard, passing through the corridor, always stopped to read the phrase. It was his daily reminder that the greatest discovery of his life hadn't been an archaeological treasure, but an extraordinary person who had worked beside him for 5 years, patiently waiting for the opportunity to shine. The morning news was broadcasting live from Sterling Holdings. Reporter Amanda Chen was interviewing Maggie about the latest archaeological discovery. "Dr. O'Sullivan," Amanda asked, "how does it feel to go from cleaning offices to leading million-dollar archaeological expeditions?" Maggie smiled, with the wisdom of someone who had traveled an impossible journey. "Amanda, I never stopped being an archaeologist. I just worked as a janitor while waiting for the right opportunity." "And what advice would you give to other people who feel trapped in positions beneath their qualifications?" "Never give up on who you are inside," Maggie replied. "Circumstances can force us into difficult situations, but they can't change our essence. Keep learning, keep growing, and be ready when opportunity knocks." The camera panned to show the bustling activity in the building. Employees of all levels working collaboratively, former hierarchies replaced by mutual respect. Richard appeared on camera, no longer the arrogant executive, but a transformed leader. "Dr. O'Sullivan taught me that the greatest treasures aren't gold or jets or luxury cars. They're the people around us and the potential we often can't see." "Mr. Sterling," Amanda asked, "do you regret making that bet?" Richard looked at Maggie and smiled genuinely. "It was the best bet I ever made, because I didn't just discover an archaeological expert. I discovered what kind of leader I wanted to become." Senator Clark, meanwhile, was facing 47 federal charges and would spend the rest of his life in prison. The criminal network he had built over 2 decades was completely dismantled. But for Maggie, the greatest victory wasn't professional, it was personal. She had proven that dignity, knowledge, and patience could overcome any prejudice. That evening, Richard knocked on Maggie's office door. "Dr. O'Sullivan, do you have a moment?" "Of course, Richard." The informality had developed naturally as they built their partnership. Richard sat down and pulled out a set of keys. "I believe these belong to you." Maggie looked at the keys. They were for the Gulfstream G650. "Richard, we discussed this. The partnership is worth more than—" "It's not about the bet," Richard interrupted. It's about justice. For 5 years you walked to work because you couldn't afford a car. Now you have a private jet." He smiled. "Sometimes symbols matter." Maggie took the keys with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, but I have a condition." "What?" "I want to use the jet for archaeological expeditions, and I want you to come on the first one." Richard was surprised. "You want me to come on an archaeological dig?" "I want to show you how amazing the world becomes when you respect the people around you," Maggie replied, "and because the best discoveries happen when people work together as equals." 3 weeks later, Richard found himself in the Jordanian desert, wearing work boots and a sun hat, carefully brushing sand off a 2,000-year-old artifact under Maggie's expert guidance. "Dr. O'Sullivan," he said as they worked side by side, "I need to ask you something." "Yes?" "That day in the office, did you know who I really was under all that arrogance?" Maggie smiled without stopping her work. "I knew you were a person capable of change, Richard. Everyone is, if given the right opportunity." "How could you tell?" "Because in 5 years of cleaning your office, I saw moments when you thought nobody was watching, moments when you helped employees quietly, when you showed genuine concern for their families." Maggie looked at him. The arrogance was a mask. The decent person underneath was who I was betting on. Richard felt tears he hadn't shed in decades. "I almost lost everything because of my prejudice." "But you didn't lose everything," Maggie replied. "You gained something much more valuable than what you could have lost." "What?" Maggie gestured around them, at the international team of archaeologists working together, at the priceless artifacts being carefully recovered, at the respect and admiration in everyone's eyes. "You gained the chance to be remembered for building something meaningful instead of just accumulating wealth," she smiled. "That's a treasure worth more than any private jet." As the sun set over the Jordanian desert, Richard understood that the greatest archaeological discovery of his life hadn't been buried in sand for centuries. It had been hiding in plain sight, pushing a cleaning cart through his hallways, waiting patiently for the moment when prejudice would finally give way to recognition. 1 year later, Sterling Holdings had become synonymous with ethical archaeology and employee empowerment worldwide. The company's transformation was featured on the cover of Harvard Business Review as the most dramatic corporate turnaround in American history. Maggie stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York, delivering a keynote speech about heritage recovery and cultural preservation. In the audience, Richard sat proudly among world leaders and academic luminaries. "Distinguished delegates," Maggie spoke with the authority of someone who had earned every word. "The preservation of human heritage requires more than funding and expertise. It requires the courage to look beyond surface appearances and recognize the extraordinary potential that often hides in the most unexpected places." The delegates rose in thunderous applause. After the speech, a young journalist approached Maggie. "Dr. O'Sullivan, your story has inspired millions around the world. What would you say to someone who feels trapped by society's expectations?" Maggie smiled, her eyes reflecting the wisdom earned through decades of struggle. "I would say that your current position doesn't define your future destination. Every janitor could be a genius. Every executive could be a learner. Every person has the potential to surprise the world. Do you ever regret the 5 years you spent in that position?" "Never," Maggie replied firmly. "Those 5 years taught me humility, patience, and how to see the world from below. They made me a better leader than I ever was as just an academic." Dr. Rodriguez, now her research partner and co-director of the Heritage Center, joined the conversation. "The results speak for themselves. In 1 year, we've recovered artifacts worth over $400 million and created 500 high-paying jobs. But the numbers don't tell the whole story," Maggie added. We've also changed how the archaeological community views collaboration between academia and business. Richard approached the group carrying a newspaper. Maggie, have you seen today's Times? The headline read, "From Janitor to Genius, the woman who changed corporate America." The article mentions that 3 major universities want to create programs based on our model, Richard said excitedly. Stanford, MIT, and Yale are all developing hidden potential identification initiatives. Maggie laughed. I hope they remember that potential doesn't hide. We just choose not to see it. Later that evening, at the celebratory gala in the Metropolitan Museum, Maggie found herself surrounded by the same type of academic elite that had once rejected her. But now, she was the guest of honor. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, Harvard's president, approached her with obvious embarrassment. Dr. O'Sullivan, I must apologize on behalf of the academic community. The treatment you received was unconscionable. Dr. Warren, Maggie replied graciously, the past has taught me that institutions are only as good as the people who lead them. The important thing is learning from mistakes. Would you consider returning to academia? Harvard would be honored to offer you an endowed chair. Maggie looked across the room at Richard, who was deep in conversation with museum directors about upcoming expeditions. Thank you, but I've found my calling, building bridges between business and academia, showing that profit and principles can coexist. Jennifer, former secretary and now Maggie's executive, assistant with a degree she'd completed through the company's education program, joined them. Dr. O'Sullivan, the president of Turkey, is on the phone. He wants to discuss the Topkapi partnership. As Maggie walked away to take the call, Dr. Warren turned to Richard. Mr. Sterling, how does it feel to have discovered such talent in your own building? Richard watched Maggie commanding respect from world leaders and smiled. It feels like winning the lottery, Dr. Warren. Except the prize was always there. I was just too blind to see it. What changed your perspective? I learned that arrogance makes us stupid, Richard replied honestly. For 5 years, I had a world-class expert working for me, and I was too prejudiced to notice. And the bet, do you regret it? Richard laughed genuinely. That bet was the smartest thing I ever did, even though it was meant to be cruel. It gave Maggie the platform she needed to show her true capabilities. Dr. Warren observed the transformed atmosphere of the event. Your company's story has become legendary in business schools. It's not my company's story, Richard corrected. It's Maggie's story. I was just lucky enough to be part of it. As the evening progressed, Maggie found herself on the museum's terrace, looking out over Manhattan. The city lights twinkled like stars, and she could see the Sterling Holdings building in the distance. Richard joined her, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. Penny, for your thoughts? I was thinking about my grandfather, Maggie said, accepting the glass. He used to say that America was the land where anyone could become anything, regardless of where they started. Do you think he was right? I think he was right, but incomplete, Maggie replied. America is the land where anyone can become anything, but only if others are willing to look beyond appearances and see potential. Speaking of potential, Richard said, I have something for you. He handed her an envelope. Inside was the title to the Lamborghini. Richard, we discussed this. It's not about the bet, he interrupted. It's about justice. You earned it with your expertise, your patience, and your integrity. Maggie smiled. And what will I do with the Lamborghini? Whatever you want, Richard replied. Sell it and fund more scholarships. Keep it as a reminder of your victory, or give it to someone who needs transportation to pursue their dreams. Maggie looked at the title, then at the city below, then at Richard. You know what I'm going to do? What? I'm going to give it to Marcus Johnson, the night janitor who's studying engineering through our program. Maggie smiled. Because sometimes the biggest gift we can give someone is showing them that we believe in their potential. Richard felt tears forming in his eyes. Maggie, you're the most extraordinary person I've ever met. No, Richard, I'm just someone who never forgot that every person has value, regardless of their job title. She paused. The extraordinary thing would be if more people understood that. As they stood together on the terrace, the former arrogant millionaire and the former invisible janitor had become something neither had expected, true partners in building a better world. Dr. O'Sullivan, Richard said formally, thank you for giving me the chance to become a better person. Thank you for having the courage to change. Maggie replied, that's rarer than you might think. The company prospered. Maggie was happy, and a janitor had proven that sometimes the wisest people are in the most unexpected places, waiting only for the right moment to reveal their true greatness. The bet that started as an act of cruelty had become a story of redemption, proving that in America, the land of second chances, anyone truly can become anything, as long as others are willing to see beyond the uniform to the person underneath. In the end, Richard learned that the most valuable thing he could give someone wasn't a private jet or a luxury car. It was respect, recognition, and the opportunity to shine. And Maggie learned that sometimes the longest journey isn't across oceans or through ancient ruins, but from invisibility to visibility, from silence to voice, from being underestimated to being irreplaceable. Their story became a testament to the American dream at its finest, not just the promise that anyone can succeed, but the reality that success is most meaningful when it lifts others up along the way.